On our last episode, Frank removed and replaced the roof of the AMMO 964 to repair the cowl, eliminate the rust, and delete the sunroof, saving 20 plus pounds. With all the grinding, chiseling, gluing, hammering, and sanding done, it was now time for Frank to hand off his work to George in the paint prep department. Find out how to strip paint from your car in 10 minutes, and trust me, this is painful to watch. That and more coming up on this episode of Drive and Protect.
All the way in.
Touch that paint on. I can hear it. At this point in the restoration, the roof is on, however, the car itself is looking pretty rough, but I'm in good hands. This is George AMMO, another 20-plus year veteran of J&B, and after spending several weeks with him, I can confidently say that if there's a problem or challenge or part that's needed and it doesn't exist, George will fabricate it or at least MacGyver it out of something sitting on his desk. It's truly remarkable to watch in person. Okay, step one is pretty simple. Remove the paint. My first impression was removing the paint required a palm sander and a few Tylenol at the end of the day. Not so. George instead prepares the hood for paint removal by first taping off the edges. I later questioned why we need to tape the edges and even cover them with more paper when the purpose is to remove all the paint anyways. Why do you care if the last half inch is covered? Well, as it turns out, if the liquid he's using drips over the edge and onto the inside of the hood, it'll strip that paint as well, which at this point, it doesn't need to be fixed, but afterwards, you'll need to repaint it. Clearly, at this point, I realized whatever it is that we're about to use is going to be some serious stuff. Next, George dumps the paint remover on the hood and spreads it with a stiff brush. Now, all I could think of was that brush was scratching my paint. I know, it's hard to break old habits. Evenly spread out, he covers the hood with a plastic sheet to keep the fumes in, and from what I'm told, it speeds up the process. This was left for about 10 to 15 minutes to cure while he started working on the cowl. Now, because the cowl was a completely new piece, 1,000 minor adjustments needed to be made to fit my particular car perfectly. First was sanding the sides of the cowl where it meets up with the original frame. Much the same goal as Frank with the rain rails, George is focused on creating a seamless transition from the cowl to the frame so it looks exactly as it did when it came from the factory. After I had a few minutes to think about it, this part's not even visible when the fender is on the car. No one's ever going to see it, but he still made it perfect. That's my kind of crazy. Next, George mixes body filler along with a hardening agent to promote drying on his mixing pad, which is basically a big piece of paper. And when you're done, you simply rip off the page and throw it away. No messy cleanup. For whatever reason, this little mixing tray makes me happy. With the tray in hand, he applies the filler to smooth the cowl to fender transition quickly before it dries. Then he allows it to harden for 10 to 15 minutes, while at the same time, he tapes up the body of my car for the paint stripping process. Oddly enough, he added another piece of paper to the floor, which was concerning at the time, but I later found out why. After the rear quarter panel was sufficiently taped, we opened up our smelly crock pot of hood and paint stripper we had left simmering for 15 minutes or so during the first step. And I have to tell you guys watching, although this looks bad on screen, it was 1,000 times worse in person. Sort of like seeing a crime scene on the news and standing next to it in real life. Two wildly different experiences. If you look at this closely, watch the chemical literally popping and curling the paint from the metal. And if you listen closely, you might be able to hear a faint popping sound similar to sort of like Rice Krispies in a bowl of milk. George then scrapes the remaining stripper and lifted paint off the hood, revealing some areas actually resisted the first round of the strong chemical. As weird as this sounds, I was actually pretty excited. Maybe 4 years of layering ammo on the paint was actually putting up a valiant effort against the wildly brutal stripper, so we needed to repeat the process again and come back in another 15 minutes. Now it was time to pour the paint stripper on the body of the car, which for whatever psychological reason was way worse. There's no turning back at this point. As the paint on the quarter panel was popping and peeling, George was scraping that dead paint off, which was falling onto the floor, hence the crime scene style floor covering from earlier. Ironically, as he was murdering my paint, a clue was actually revealed about how many times my rear quarter panel was repainted, unbeknownst to me, by the previous owners.
Paint 1, 2, 3 times at least.
3 times it's been painted.
This black here, the first one. The second one is the one on the top, the yellow. And the third one is the one on the top, this.
Due to the 3 layers of paint, he had to repeat the process 3 times before it reached the condition where sanding would be easy. Now, with the hood and quarter panel baking again, he turns his focus onto the cowl, which has dried and is ready to be sanded at this point. On a completely side note, doesn't George remind you of some sort of master chef with 5 pots on the stove, a bird in the oven, and chopping vegetables at the same time in this weird body shop type ballet? Anyways, he uses a black sander to smooth out the driver's side cowl until the transition looks as if it came directly from Germany. Afterwards, any dents or imperfections he found by hand were lightly tapped back into shape with his hammer. Let me give you an example of how perfect he was making these panels. This is my windshield wiper shaft, and at the base of it is a small manufacturing defect or divot, right there. So, this and any other areas around the car that were not 100% perfect were hammered out or filled and sanded perfectly flat. Now, back over to the stove one last time. It seems our roast is done. The paint is falling off the bones with ease. Alright, I promise I'm done with the food and crime analogies. But either way, the majority of the paint has been removed and the true condition of the metal revealed. He then quickly washes the hood down with a standard solvent to remove the remnants of chemical stripper, then unwraps the tape and paper and prepares for sanding with a 40 grit sanding disc. Once the hood is free of every last area of paint, he sands it with 80 grit for further refinement, then repeats these steps with 180 grit and so on all the way up to 400 grit until the metal can no longer hide any tiny bits of oxidation in its early stages of growth like these here. To remove them, a tiny wire brush attached to a drill is used to grind them away before they get any worse. For whatever reason, this extra 4 minutes of effort on George's part was so impactful for me. Think about it, most repaints would have most likely just gone over these spots and no one would ever know the difference until 3, 4, 5 years later when they would need to be addressed again. So him eliminating this worry for me was so meaningful. After spending a bit of time thinking about these spots, another fascinating point about these areas is their location. They're on the front part of the hood closest to the bumper. For all you detailers out there, these are most likely rock chip impact points. This is what happens when your chips are not addressed immediately. They allow water to make contact with the metal in that spot and then it grows. One of my biggest pet peeves is the idea that touch-up paint's primary purpose is to make the car look better. This is false. Its primary purpose on metal is to prevent future oxidation, which is painfully real as you can see here. The very distant and secondary purpose of touch-up paint is to have your car's paint look visually appealing. It's the same idea as having a cut on your arm or your hand, and you put a Band-Aid on it to promote healing and to prevent infections from the open wound. No one puts a Band-Aid on only to hide the injury and not to protect their skin. That would be completely insane. Remember this, think of your paint like skin. If you treat it this way, it'll stay healthy and strong for years to come. Now, despite the hood looking good with the naked eye, George sprays solvent on the metal to act as a mirror reflecting in the overhead lights. What was once virtually impossible to see before becomes blatantly obvious now. Notice the 2 holes for the Porsche emblem. Do you see the long creases running down from both sides of the holes? This is from years of closing the hood using your palm on the emblem. It's been an unwritten Porsche rule since forever. But the safest place to close the hood is directly over the locking system, closest to the edge or the front of the hood, where the hood is less flexible and easily creased over time under the weight of your upper body. Next, George feels for additional spots that can't simply be hammered out and quickly scuffs them up so the polyester filler will stick better and fill in the divots. The polyester he's using is similar to Bondo, but much thinner and typically used for finishing such as this. While letting this filler dry, he hopped back over to sanding the quarter panel, which revealed another clue why this area had been repainted while the rest of the car, as we discovered later, had no bodywork or repairs whatsoever. Notice the dust coming off as he palm sands. Does it look familiar? It looks just like the area near the cowl as he was sanding it earlier. Now I know the driver's side rear panel must have been scratched or dinged in the past and then repaired. And now, after many years, it's finally getting fixed properly. I kind of felt like a guy who keeps flickering the light switch on and off in his house, and he can't figure out where the wire goes and why it's not working, and his OCD forces him, in this random unrelated example, to tear apart his entire house to find the wires and do it properly, or at least that's what my therapist tells me. With the polyester dry on the hood, George re-drills the emblem holes and block sands the filler in diagonal strokes until it's perfectly smooth. Next, the edges of the hood are scuffed up with a red scuff pad so the primer will properly adhere to the curved areas. Then, George tapes the sides before 2 coats of primer are added. George then mixes the first layer of primer focused exclusively on rust prevention. This brownish liquid coats the metal and blocks water from reaching the metal and causing oxidation. Once completely dry, a second layer of different primer is carefully measured and weighed before a thick coat is applied. This white primer is focused on filling in the scratches from all the palm and block sanding done earlier. While waiting for the second coat to dry, I then noticed George had coated both repaired areas of my rusted frame in a thick, rubbery permanent coating called Por 15. I think at this point, if my car was dropped in the ocean for a month, I'd have 0 chance of possible rust, and that, once again, makes me happy. For the sake of time, 2 more coats of the second primer was added, and this entire process you just watched up until this point was repeated on every other panel of the car, taking roughly 3 weeks to complete. So let's fast forward to when the car has been fully primed and ready for sanding.
Okay, what I did here is I started with paint remove, strip all car, clean all car, look for defects, dents and rust, clean everything, fix everything with plastic, polyester, make everything smooth and nice, and get it ready for primer. So I prime all car, all the parts of primer. Now I start a black. I black it because the car is not really a lot of damage and a lot of body work, so I just black everything with 320. 320 by hand to look for defects, little dents, little things, you know, small defects you can find it, and make it really nice. And now we got to go with 600, and after 600 my job is done. So next it goes to the other side to do 800 and be painted.
Before the car leaves for the paint department, George applies a light layer of dry coat guide to the primer. This allows him to see texture or sanding scratches he would otherwise be unable to recognize when looking at white primer with the naked eye. As you can see, the light scratches appear when contrasted against the black guide coat. Now he can see what he's sanding. Finally, for those of you who are Porsche enthusiasts, you'll remember when the automatic spoiler or wing came out on the all-new redesigned Porsche 964 in the late 80s, early 90s, and for whatever reason, most of these stock wings have stress cracks on both edges. George originally tried to completely remove the plastic housing, but will later discover it's actually glued down.
I think it's glue.
So he improvised by grinding away the plastic with a Dremel, replacing it with plastic filler, and sanding it before repainting. For me, this was the perfect ending to my time in the paint prep department. But don't worry, we'll see George again when it's time to put the car back together. On next week's episode, I take you inside the paint booth to watch the step-by-step process for concours painting, sanding, repainting, and polishing fresh paint to perfection. If you like this video, please subscribe below or visit my website for more helpful how-to car care videos. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.